In 1595, Sir Francis Drake was in retirement. He was an MP and had been Mayor of Plymouth, where his most notable achievement was improving the city's water supply. But his heart was 1,000 miles away. When he prepared a book to remind the Queen of his achievements, it was titled, rather pathetically, Sir Francis Drake Revived.
I have accounted it my duty to present this discourse to your Majesty, that your servant's labour seem not altogether lost.
Drake was driven by three demons: ambition, hatred of Spain, and religious zeal. And the three things, for the greater part of his career, meshed together beautifully for him.
10 years earlier, he'd been at the very centre of England's struggle for survival as a Protestant island against Catholic Spain. Philip II laid claim to Africa, Asia, the New World, and much of the continent of Europe. English sailors were banned from the world's richest ports and the trade routes to every other continent.
Drake was a brilliant exponent of the guerrilla warfare of the sea. His Latin name, Draco, literally means dragon, and that's just how Drake operated, like a serpent slinking unseen among the waves, and coming up unexpectedly to take bites out of the Spanish Empire in surprising places. And the surprise effect was almost like that later attained by submarine warfare. And at first, these guerrilla tactics were bound to be successful against the Spanish Empire's vast monarchy, very vulnerable to bandit attacks.
His cannon fire was aimed not just at the Spanish galleons that carried the treasure he craved. It was his version of the righteous wrath of God.
He certainly was a man of great religious zeal, and this dated right back to his childhood. I mean, his father was a naval preacher. And I suppose the earliest experience that really must have put the iron in his soul was when he and his family were turfed out of their home in Devon by a Catholic uprising and had to go and live on a rotting hulk in Kent. And he never forgave Spain, and he never forgave the Catholic world for that. Every day he read not only the Bible, but Fox's Book of Martyrs.
It was that passion that had made him into more than just one raider among many, and magnified him into greatness. He had managed to sail right around South America into the Pacific Ocean, and had become, it was said, the master thief of the unknown world. Only one ship had ever made such a journey before, and that was over 50 years earlier. Magellan had set out with 5 ships. 3 years later, with Magellan dead, just one of the ships drifted back to Europe. There were 17 sailors left alive. They had survived by eating the rigging. Drake came back in a very different style. He returned with a fortune plundered from Spanish ships in an ocean where they had no reason to expect enemies. He presented Elizabeth with a fortune, and she knighted him for it. In 1585, when England was trying to find some way of preventing Spain from assembling the Armada, Elizabeth sent him back to the Caribbean to do as much damage as possible. He had burned some of the most important cities in the Caribbean, including Santo Domingo and Cartagena. But Spain had mounted its armada nevertheless, and having failed to destroy England, was now preparing a new armada. There were fears that it would be ready by spring 1596. Drake believed that England needed him again. But the Queen and her military chiefs didn't much care for Francis Drake. When they'd actually come to do battle with the Armada in 1588, he'd nearly destroyed the English defences by going off on his own. The whole fleet was meant to be following his lantern. When he saw a rich Spanish ship fall out of formation, he put his lantern out and went to claim it as his personal prize. When dawn broke, the English commander-in-chief, who thought he'd been following Drake's light, found himself alone in the middle of the Spanish fleet. Some people felt Sir Francis was simply not to be trusted. And he'd wrecked his own career the year after the Armada, when he led a fleet to counterattack Spain in a complete disaster. 2/3 of the English navy perished. Drake was plainly a dangerous adventurer. His reputation was more secure in Spain than it was in England.
There are two Spanish legends of Drake. There's Drake the bogey, with whom mothers in Venezuela still threaten their naughty children. Drake the arch heretic, the bloodthirsty pirate, the diabolical figure in league with Satan. But at the same time, there's the legendary Drake of whom Spanish poets and balladeers sang in poems written in Spanish in his own lifetime and shortly after, something unthinkable in England, where Drake's fellow captains deeply detested and resented him, whilst Spaniards were admiring him.
To make it in England, he had to redeem himself, and he believed that there was only one place to do that, in the Caribbean. Spain's money was sweated out of the land in South America. Much of it came from a great hill of silver at Potosí in Bolivia. It was shipped from Peru to Panama and then overland to be loaded onto galleons from Seville. Silver was power. Without silver, Spain would have neither ships nor soldiers. Panama was the glittering prize on the far side of the mountains. Loot Panama and England would be rich and Spain poor. The jungle trail from Panama to the Caribbean carried 10 times the annual income of the English crown, and it all came to this beach, the open bay of Nombre de Dios. All Drake had to do was to persuade Elizabeth that he really could fatally cripple Spain. Reluctantly, in the spring of 1595, she finally agreed to a fleet being assembled, and even gave 6 ships of her own. But she didn't give them permission to set sail, and she insisted that Drake not be in sole charge. John Hawkins, 10 years older and a sober businessman, was to be joint commander. Not an easy job. Last time Drake had been given a joint commander, Thomas Doughty, he beheaded him. Hawkins had been Drake's employer when he was younger, shipping slaves from Africa to sell to Spanish colonists. Foreigners were not allowed to trade in the Caribbean, and this smuggling was hugely profitable.
The Caribbean, in those days, the early days of the Spanish Empire, was an enterprise culture. It's where traders and captains and garrison commanders meet to do deals. You always have the distinction between the men at the top setting the policy and the poor buggers on the ground who've actually got to try and take it into effect. If they'd gone by the rules, many of those garrisons would have been wiped out, would have died of fever, would have died of starvation.
When Drake began freebooting on his own account, he realized that he'd more in common with the slaves than with their purchasers. They hated Spain as much as he did.
It was then that he first made an alliance with the Cimarrones of Panama. These were blacks who'd escaped from the local Spanish settlements and lived more or less as outlaws in the countryside. And in working with these people, Drake developed a genuine respect for them and even an affection. When he was on his voyage around the world, a witness said that he spoke about them almost daily.
The Cimarrones looked after him in the jungle. and one day had led him to a hill where he saw for the first time the view across to the Pacific Ocean. He had vowed to sail that sea. He knew these places, Hawkins did not. He would have difficulty sharing command.
He could, of course, in achieving and maintaining sole command, go totally over the top. And my favourite story is of this when he was on the circumnavigation. His chaplain was heard to be murmuring against the captain. And so what does Drake do? Gets hold of the chaplain, he chains him to the foremast, puts a placard round his neck saying Francis Fletcher, the falsest knave that ever lived. But more than that, gathers the whole crew round and says, Francis Fletcher, I excommunicate thee out of the church of God and consign you to the devil and all his angels. Now, this, by any stretch of the imagination, is a bit OTT, isn't it, for a layman and a commander of a ship to his religious advisor?
Sir John, who was much older, he was cautious, he was plodding, he was methodical. And right from the beginning, these two were quarrelling. And these quarrels weren't minor problems. They led to serious delays.
They agreed only in giving out a glorious title to their intended journey, and in not so well victualling the navy as I deem was Her Majesty's pleasure it should be. Miserably providing for us would free them from incurring any great loss whatsoever befell of the journey.
The words of Thomas Maynard, one of many ambitious young men who volunteered for the expedition to follow their legendary hero, Francis Drake, and who was now sitting in an idle fleet that had still not been given permission to sail anywhere.
It was very doubtful whether the journey should proceed, had not the news of a galleon of the King of Spain, which was driven into San Juan de Puerto Rico with 2.5 millions of treasure, come under them.
More than 50 tons of silver. Elizabeth had doubted whether Drake could capture Panama, but this was irresistible.
Her Majesty, persuaded of the easy taking thereof, commanded them to haste their departure.
The Caribbean had changed since 1586, the last time he'd been there. Then the ports were easy to attack and were pretty well undefended. But after that, Philip II had hired an Italian engineer to make a professional overhaul of the whole area. There are no portraits of Juan Battista Antonelli. He worked for a salary, not for glory. He was a new kind of man who left technical drawings rather than legends behind him. This is a plan of the fort at Puerto Rico in 1591. By November 1595, it had gone a lot further.
Drake's last voyage pitted that highly professional, almost technocratic style of warfare exemplified by the Spanish Empire with an old-fashioned, chivalric, almost feudal style represented by Drake himself, the exemplar of the knight-errantry of the sea. By the time of his last voyage, he had become an anachronism.
How very marvellous of us to be able to sit here 400 years later and have the luxury to say that. Imagine yourself in the position of a garrison commander, sitting in some fever-ridden hole in the Caribbean. All of a sudden, a pinnace comes into harbour saying, El Draco is over the horizon with 12 ships. And you sit back and you say to your chaps, oh, well, it doesn't really matter in the long run of history. Drake will be a man of no consequence whatsoever. By hell you don't. You get off your arse and run around like a blue-tailed fly. No? No, he was a man of enormous significance and importance in his own age.
This fleet was enough to alarm anyone. It had, of course, been put together to capture Panama rather than loot a single galleon. There were over 20 ships with 1,500 sailors and an invasion force of 2,500 soldiers. He was riding back to glory, hindered, it was true, by the cautious Hawkins, but Hawkins was a very sick man. On the night they anchored off Puerto Rico, Hawkins died. Drake wouldn't have to behead him after all. San Juan de Puerto Rico was an old established colony and a rather comfortable backwater. 1,000 or so old families were well settled in. This is the original governor's mansion. It was already 70 years old in 1595. Treasure normally bypassed Puerto Rico completely. The stranded galleon had been stuck for 6 months now. No one in Puerto Rico had much idea what to do about it. Once news of Drake's departure reached Spain, 5 frigates were dispatched to the island. Drake had moved so slowly that the frigates got there first. Drake was just a few days behind. The islanders talked about getting on the frigates and running for their lives, but they had deep roots here, farms, houses, all their money. The council decided to stand up to the raiders.
They had 2 weeks advance notice. 1595 reports state that they were working day and night ready to make preparations and throughout the islet in the eastern end and in the Morro Fortress right where we are standing and some of the gun emplacements near the bay. They brought in the cannons and the weapons of some frigates that were here. When they began to construct the trenches, even the bishop and the priest got involved in encouraging the citizens, and so they were all fired up and ready to defend.
The town fortress, La Fortaleza, was also about 70 years old. It looked like nothing so much as a medieval Spanish castle and was about as useless against modern cannon. But the treasure would be safer here than in a ship. It was unloaded into the castle dungeon. The treasure was immense. It would have filled 100 chests. And now Drake had come for it, raiding as he used to do. But when the English got there, the military commander on board, Thomas Baskerville, realized that something had changed.
We came to anchor before the port, which we found otherwise fortified than we expected. For upon the entrance of the harbour stood a castle of quarried stone, having 3 platforms, one above the other, upon which stood more than 30 pieces of cannon and culverin.
Drake cautiously anchored a couple of miles to the west, off a beach. There's a long reef along the shore, but it's possible to get small boats behind it at one spot if the sea is calm. Maynard wanted to get a landing party ashore at once and take the island by storm, but Drake told him to wait. Within hours, the islanders had moved cannon onto small coastal fortifications, and Drake found himself being blasted by shot. His own cabin was hit.
There was a real determination in the island, on everybody's part, to protect it. Was there the same determination on the part of the English to attack it?
From those reports and considering Drake's maneuvers, I don't get that impression. Because his first encounter at the El Morrillo site in the eastern end of the island, where they could have attempted a landing, well, they just sent some kind of a reconnaissance boat, which as soon as they heard some cannon fire, decided to retreat. But they did not put a landing to test. And then they moved near the Morro entrance here.
If they weren't going to land on a beach, they were going to have to sail into the harbour entrance. It was hard to see how the cannon of Antonelli's fortress could fail to hit them. And then there were the frigates themselves, sitting inside the harbour, ready to destroy those that did get past the guns.
It was therefore concluded that the boat should set fire to the frigates. On the 13th at night, passing in hard under the fort, we set 3 of them on fire, only one of which burned.
Fire ships were a tried and tested system for scaring the enemy out of his wits. That was how the Armada had been scattered when it tried to anchor at Calais. But the Spanish were not so easily frightened now.
The burnt ship gave a great light, the enemy thereby playing upon us with their ordnance and small shot as if it had been fair day, and sinking some of our boats.
Some 25 landing craft tried to get into the harbour, supported by cannon fire from the fleet. Maynard, who was in charge of some of the boats, said the oarsmen panicked in the barrage. The battle to get into the harbour lasted just 1 hour.
They attempted to get in the bay, but they saw that the defenses were perhaps heavier than they counted, and maybe this was not their main objective. If we can get the easy boot, the treasure, fine. If not, no further attempts.
Drake called his officers together and told them they would have to pull out.
The general presently said, "I will bring thee to 20 places far more wealthy and easier to be gotten." And hence we went.
What was Drake up to? He had been slow in getting here, had not been very determined to fight his way in, and now he did something that has baffled historians ever since. He took the whole fleet off towards a small port on the coast of Colombia.
If you look at his great triumphs in the past, they're based on speed, they're based on energy, determination, decisiveness, and a mastery of surprise tactics. He appears where people don't expect him to be. He goes straight into the problem in front of him. Now, in the 1595 voyage, you see a man who seems rather unsure. He dithers in front of the enemy, and he gives them a lot of opportunities to prepare for what he's going to do.
But although some of the crew wrote accounts of what was happening on this voyage, Drake didn't. Perhaps we should look a bit harder at this little town. It's called Rio Hacha, Axe River. The region hasn't changed much in 400 years. Wilder is a local historian and is from the Indian population of this lawless region.
Cuando Drake vino a finales del siglo XVI, Rio Hacha era una ciudad dedicada a la explotación y comercio de las perlas. Tenía un contorno indígena hostil, pues los indígenas que se encontraban allí eran indios bravos. Rio Hacha era una ciudad fronteriza con la nación de los indios guajiros, los cuales nunca fueron sometidos por la corona española. Todavía la mantiene. Rio Hacha es una ciudad fronteriza, lo sigue siendo, no solo con la República de Venezuela, es una avanzada de Colombia en el territorio de los indígenas guayú modernos.
¿Y el contrabando todavía es un asunto aquí?
Todavía persiste, como en los tiempos de Drake, porque el contrabando es parte de un principio de autonomía política de los indios de la Guajira y además de eso, de los nexos culturales y económicos con el Caribe.
There's no doubt that this area is still, as it always has been, on the frontier of the law. This submersible sitting in open view on the beach is, according to locals, used to smuggle cocaine between here and Florida. The conditions of life haven't changed much either. These fishermen eke out a living from a simple wooden dugout. They dive to 30 feet, hunting for pearls, like their ancestors. The pearl fisheries were started by Spanish settlers trying to make some money out of the New World. But by the 1590s, the Indians had rebelled and seized control of some of the rancherias, the pearl stations. Indians here have grown up in absolute poverty, surrounded by wealth.
Jugábamos con las perlas. Con las perlas íbamos a las tienditas a comprar los dulces y cambiábamos las perlas por los dulces. Sí. Y eso llegaban toda esa cantidad de perlas y nos poníamos allí con los abuelos, con mis papás, a buscar, a examinarlas, ¿no? O a seleccionar las perlas, ¿no? A seleccionarlas por tamaño, por color, no por calidad. Y todo eso sí, desde muy niña, pues nosotros nos ponían a eso, porque como había tanta perla que, ajá, ese era el trabajo pues de nosotros.
But this can't be one of the 20 places richer than Puerto Rico that Drake had spoken of. He must have come for some other reason besides loot. And he knew this area very well. In fact, it was the first place he'd ever visited in the Caribbean, 30 years earlier. When Drake had his first job on a slaving ship, he was selling slaves to work on these pearl fisheries when they were still controlled by Spanish businessmen. Drake, it seems, saw that there was more than just a cash profit to be had on this coast. The local priest, Juan de Castellanos, thought he was after something much bigger.
There is more to this man than the motivation of pure piracy.
Drake was a warrior against everything that priest stood for.
Rumors say that he was trying to displace the Spanish hold for English rule, that he said, "This new world must be shared between the nations. We all have the same rights."
And it looks as though this was the moment when he might actually make it happen. On this coast, the Spanish Catholic Empire was disintegrating.
Desde 1593 hasta 1594 en adelante se iniciaron grandes alzamientos indígenas para rebelarse contra el dominio español. Estos indígenas tenían tratos con los ingleses y sus rebeliones coincidieron con los ataques de los piratas. Yo pienso que él estaba atraído por las perlas como atractivo económico principal, pero pienso que Drake era rabiosamente anticatólico y anti-español, y por eso todo quien estuviera contra la corona española era su aliado potencial.
The regional governor certainly thought Drake was likely to have a devastating effect.
The Indians were in revolt and the whole country in a state of war and insecurity. There would be especially serious peril if the forces of this fleet should compel us to withdraw.
Many Englishmen, including Drake, believed that the Indians would rather deal with them than evil Spaniards.
On one occasion, his people were attacked by Indians, and he refused to allow his men to retaliate because he said that they had learned to hate the Europeans because they had suffered ill treatment at the hands of the Spaniards. Drake did not look on the local populations as potential enemies, or so much as potential enemies, but rather as potential allies, allies against a common enemy of Spain.
But since he left no journal himself, we only know about the hopes of the men with him. The only thing they were interested in was immediate loot, and there wasn't much of that.
This town was left bare of goods. The inhabitants, having intelligence of our coming, had carried all in the woods and hid their treasure.
Drake spent more than 2 weeks apparently haggling with the Spanish governor for a price in pearls to make him go away, and then he declared that the pearls were substandard and burnt the town anyway, which is why Drake is remembered with affection by the Indians here. The real centre of power, though, was a few miles to the east, Cartagena, and here Antonelli had constructed serious defences which Drake could not challenge. He decided that it was time to turn to the main business of the voyage. His fleet arrived at the Panama Isthmus early in January, 6 weeks after first arriving in the Caribbean. Once more, the theory goes, we're looking at a sad old man who lacks the fiery dash of his youth.
The English approached their targets ponderously and slowly. They telegraphed their punches, they advertised their presence, and they gave the enemy time to prepare. Now the old Drake, the Drake of the 70s and 80s, the early 80s certainly, he would have preempted all those preparations by a very sudden descent.
But Drake had been planning carefully. He was planning the greatest robbery in history. He had probably pulled out of Puerto Rico to avoid risking his soldiers on a sideshow. He had possibly gone some way to breaking Spanish power on the mainland, and he had to hang around for weeks before launching his attack on Panama because of the climate. The road from Nombre de Dios to Panama was called El Camino Real, the Royal Road. It was a mule track. The paved section near Panama City still survives. If they had gone straight to Nombre de Dios from Puerto Rico, Drake's soldiers would have landed at the height of the rainy season. 140 inches of rain falls here each year. The jungle paths would have been impassable, but the rainfall drops dramatically during December. Drake could have been waiting for the start of the short dry season, and to have planned his landing for the earliest moment when he could expect reasonable conditions. The going should now be firm. This was going to be the greatest raid in history. It was what the 2,500 troops were for. They arrived at Nombre de Dios knowing that there was almost 4 million pesos waiting on the other side of the isthmus, and no defenses to stop them landing. Drake's plan was to send nearly 1,000 troops along the mule track. A few days later, he would take the fleet to the Chagres River and navigate it to within 15 miles of the treasure city. They would hold Panama for a few days, load up the fleet with the loot, and make a getaway. It would be totally audacious. The 20th century equivalent would have been if Che Guevara had robbed Fort Knox and delivered the contents to Castro. Meanwhile, on the other side of the mountain, the Spanish were moving slowly. Although a general called Sotomayor had come to Panama from Peru, for 10 days the officials there refused to recognize his letters of authority. He wasn't able to head for the coast until the 26th of December. That was just 11 days before Drake arrived. By then, Sotomayor had investigated the trail, Nombre de Dios, and a new port being constructed just up the coast, Portobello. He arrived here while Drake was just 6 days away, and found Antonelli, the master builder of defenses, hard at work. They both agreed that Nombre de Dios and Portobello could not be defended. Orders were given that when the English attacked, the few troops here should fall back to a pass on the Camino Real. Antonelli had already put a few defenses in position there, and they sent some soldiers up with supplies, but that was not their main priority. They were convinced that Drake was likeliest to attack up the Chagres River. They concluded that their main job now must be to block the river. On the day before Drake landed, they started clearing a site for a river fort. They didn't get news of the landing until the 8th of January, the day after it happened. By this time, Drake's army was already marching inland. They abandoned their new fortification. It should have been dry underfoot and easy going, but a dry season in the tropics is not to be relied upon. It rained. The best account of what happened was written by the commander, Thomas Baskerville.
The first 3 miles upon the top of a mountain covered with wood so narrow that the breadth was not above 40 foot, through which passage was cut, which being clay, with the continual going of their mules and daily falling of rain, is so muddy and foul that every step is above the knee.
They actually came this way?
They must have. This is the Camino Real. And they were carrying 40 bullets, food for 9 days, their bandoliers, weapons, and covering 9 miles a day. In these conditions, they would have had a hard time.
You're already soaked through, aren't you?
I am. In this kind of forest, you're always soaked, even when you're just standing. So their powder, everything they had, they must have been just soaked completely through.
And of course they were unlucky with the weather.
Yes, at the time of the year they were coming through, it should have been dry, but it wasn't, which was against them.
The Spanish troops from the coast had made exactly the same journey, retreating just ahead of the English. Next morning, the English were 9 miles up the trail. The Spanish, 10 miles further ahead, had reached the pass they would have to defend. Tired and wet as they were, they started desperately cutting trees and building their defense work. Meanwhile, the English were struggling towards them.
We marched over the mountain, the passage very ill, being all clay, which by continual rain that falls there so foul that every step is to the mid-leg, and this is to be considered that all the rest is so thick in wood that there is no other passage to be thought on. We entered a river, being sometimes to the midst, sometime deeper, and for the most part to the mid-thigh, the course of which we followed for some 9 miles, 6 of which being passed, the way grew very difficult. and the shallows full of great slippery rocks above the water. Over the deepest holes we were forced to pass upon the side of a rock which sloped to that hole, which being covered with some 3 fingers of water made it slippery, that he that missed footing was drowned without remedy.
You can imagine that after walking through this kind of terrain, a river like this for a couple of days, people would have been exhausted having to fight all the current and clinging to all the rocks, trying not to be pulled into the swift current that is flowing through this gully here. A lot of the river is like that, and it must have been hell for them.
Over this place we passed, having only lost 1 man. So, following the course of this river some half-mile, we struck over the top of a mountain and entered another river, which we followed for 4.5. We found ourselves in great miseries, for all the powder we carried in our pockets was wholly lost, our match greatly decayed, our victual altogether spoiled, and ourselves barefoot.
The English spent the night about 2,000 yards from the pass where the retreating Spanish soldiers were going to make their stand. The Spanish were ready by dawn, and at 8 in the morning the English arrived, about 100 Spaniards against 900 English. Sotomayor and Antonelli and most of the Spanish soldiers who had been working busily on the Chagres River were coming as fast as they could, but were still several hours away. The old English pirate had fooled them. But
the place was so assured, being upon the nape of a hill far higher than the rest, the way to attempt it not being above 3 foot broad, no way could be found to pass it, but only through the fort.
20 miles away, Drake was preparing to sail around to the Chagres River. The defenses there were ramshackle and unlikely to stop him. But up in the jungle, a desperate struggle was going on. For 3 hours, the English fought to find a way round the Spaniards.
They attacked our defenses furiously. Some climbed so far as to lay hands on the guns above them, which were shooting them down.
But it was simply hopeless.
Seeing our powder spent and the impossibility of carrying the place, we resolved to return. All our powder, victuals, and means to relieve ourselves were wholly consumed, and many hurt men.
It was over, and everyone understood how close it had been, and how complete the failure.
I returned with marvelous trouble and great difficulty. This journey brake wholly those troops I carried with me.
This march hath made many swear that he will never venture to buy gold at such a price again.
Back at the fleet, some of them started writing down exactly what they thought of Francis Drake.
Like as upon the coming of the sun, dews and mists begin to vanish, so our blinded eyes began now to open, and we found that the glorious speeches of 100 places that they knew in the Indies to make us rich was but a bait to draw Her Majesty to give them honourable employment, and us to adventure our lives for their glory. We stayed at a waste island. There was no relief but a few tortoises for such as could catch them, 12 days. This is counted the sickliest place of the Indies, and here died many of our men.
Drake fell into a deep depression. Maynard was bold enough to ask him exactly where they were going to find what they'd come for.
He answered me with grief, protesting that he was as ignorant of the Indies as myself, and that he never thought any place could be so changed, as it were, from a delicious and pleasant arbour into a waste and desert wilderness. Besides the variableness of the wind and weather so stormy and blusterous as he never saw it before. But he most wondered that since his coming out of England he never saw sail worth the giving chase to. Yet in the greatness of his mind he would in the end conclude with these words: "It matters not, man. God hath many things in store for us, and I know many means to do Her Majesty good service and to make us rich. For we must have gold before we see England."
The man they really relied upon to pull them out of the crisis and to give them successes seems to have lost all sense of direction. Drake was in a depression, he fell ill, he kept to his cabin for most of the time. He was out of sight, and there must have been a general sense of demoralization.
And since our return from Panama, he never carried mirth nor joy in his face. Here he began to grow sickly. He had risked his own reputation greatly in promising Her Majesty to do her honourable service and to return her a very profitable adventure, and had sufficiently experienced for 7 or 8 years together how hard it was to regain favour once ill thought of.
Now Drake really did drift aimlessly, hampered by bad weather, and finally returned to the area of Nombre de Dios. Just along the coast were Antonelli's new defences at Portobello. Antonelli, the mercenary engineer who was paid a salary, the mere professional, who had, in the end, blocked him at every turn and changed the Caribbean from Drake's playground into his nemesis. Within sight of the new defences, Drake now waited for death. Fever was ravaging the fleet. 500 men were dying. Every day corpses were tossed into the sea and washed up, rotting on the beaches.
He tried all the options he knew and he failed. It would have been very difficult for him to go back because he was going to bring ruin to many of the investors and he was going to destroy or at least damage his reputation. His career was certainly at an end.
On the mainland, Spanish power remained undamaged, and the Catholic Church, which Drake had hoped to wound to its very heart, retained its mastery. It still does. Behind the walls of Portobello, the Catholic Church survives in a form which has not changed for centuries. The annual celebration of the Black Christ draws penitents who cross the isthmus 50 miles on their knees. To some, it represents piety and hope for mankind. To Francis Drake, it represented the rule of a harsh and savage church through the power of superstition. Throughout the voyage, one of Drake's officers had made drawings of the landfalls. These were pilotage drawings, intended to help the next English ship to come here when the power of the Spanish over the Caribbean had been broken. The book was never finished. The drawings are dated in a rather confusing way. They use the Old English calendar, 10 days earlier than the Spanish calendar we all now use.
This morning, on the description noted or taken of this land, being the 28th of January, being Wednesday in the morning, Sir Francis Drake died of the bloody flux, right off the island of Buenaventura, some 6 leagues at sea, who now resteth with the Lord.
To avoid the body being washed ashore, it was placed in a lead coffin. The island of Buenaventura, the island of good opportunity, is now called Drake Island.
If you look at those qualities that the English like to ascribe to themselves, like pluck in adversity and effortless superiority over foreigners, and treating life as a game and war as a game, they're all indelibly connected with the legend of Drake in English memory.
Drake, he's in his hammock till the great armadas come. Captain not there sleeping there below, slung atween the round shot, listening for the drum, and dreaming all the time of Plymouth Hoe.
When the ships got home, the sailors were left on board, unpaid and without food. The men who had marched through the jungle were charged for the clothes they had spoiled.
Take my drum to England, hang it by the shore, strike it when your powder's running low. If the Dun sight Devon, I'll quit the Port of Evan and drum them up the channel as we drummed them long ago.
There is a drum, it exists, and it is allegedly carried on Drake's last voyage, and it's preserved in Devon today. The story goes that when the country's in danger, this ghostly tattoo will be beaten on this drum, and Sir Francis will come from his watery grave in the Panamanian area and return to assist the country. In the First World War, people swore they heard this drum beating at the time the Kaiser's fleet surrendered, and in the Second World War, people claimed that they heard the drum beating along the seaside in 1940.
Call him on the deep sea, call him up the sound, call him when ye sail to meet the foe, where the old trade's plying and the old flag flying, they shall find him where and waken as they found him long ago.